Let's have an unpopular conversation about guns from an outsider's perspective to the United States, because you do seem to have a unique issue with firearms and the consequences of wholesale firearm ownership that to an outsider seems completely insane. Nobody outside the US really understands why you can't take the basic step of having halfway decent gun control. You can disagree with me and my perspective and everything, that's fine. We don't have to agree so long as you live over there and I live here where it's safe. But I just want to explore the problem and consider the issues and think about what could be blue sky, potential fixes for the issue. I think the fundamental problem that America has with guns is that its relationship with firearms isn't rational. It's not approached in a rational basis. Rather, it's steeped in tradition and emotion and self-image and fear. Mostly fear of other people with guns, which is where it becomes kind of circular. But America still thinks of itself as this rugged individualist, pull up by your bootstraps kind of culture. It still thinks of itself very much as a frontier culture. These are its cultural archetypes, if you will. The cowboy, all of that, the homesteader, the gunfighter, even. And having access to a firearm kind of lives out that fantasy. And also the whole rebellion against Britain and everything, the idea of being able to throw off the shackles of tyranny and so on, that's very much steeped into it. And the idea of self-protection, none of this holds up to real scrutiny. And the other part of the tradition is, of course, the Constitution, which weirdly is regarded as this kind of immutable scriptural document when it was designed to be changed and altered and added to and taken away from. The people who crafted the Constitution were very smart in that way. The idea that it would be a living document that could shift and change with the times. And I imagine they would be horrified by the way that people treat it as Holy Writ. I think they would be concerned by that. But yeah, the relationship is emotional. None of this stands up to scrutiny. You're no longer a frontier nation. You no longer need a militia, which is mentioned in the document, or rather that the role of the militia has been taken over by the National Guard, because you didn't have a standing army at the time, and you do now. There's also the conflict between people who see America as a collection of states and people who see it as a singular nation. Differences of vision there, which have blown up before and helped contribute to the Civil War, even if it's not the main thrust of the Civil War. All of this this relationship to these guns, the fear, the tradition, all of it all really comes down to emotion, and none of it really holds up to rational scrutiny. Not the militia, not the self-defense. You're more likely to be hurt or killed if you have a gun or attempt to use a gun in self-defense than if you don't. Basically, having a firearm around ups the stakes and makes everything much more deadly. It makes suicide easier, accidents more likely, all the rest of it, and it's not needed for this overthrowing of tyranny or whatever else. I mean, the Iron Curtain countries that fell after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that was accomplished by turning the army or just by mass people power. So it's all myth, really, and that's the big problem with it. I mean, there's no denying that guns are cool, like any engineered thing is, like cars can be cool. There's just something visceral and powerful and cool about guns as objects, but what they do is not so cool, just in the way that you see a big military vehicle or a fighter jet screaming through the sky. It's cool. What a wonder of human accomplishment. And then you start to think about what it does, becomes a bit less cool. Now, other modern Western nations don't have this problem that America has with guns, or at least if they do have the problem, it's a much lesser problem. I mean, even accounting for scale of population and so on, these kind of mass shootings, these kind of events just don't happen to the same degree, the same proportion, the same rate at all as they do in the United States. So why is there such a differential between America and other first world nations? Well, the first and most obvious thing is that America has lots of guns. Most other modern first world nations have decided that it's just not worth it, other than, you know, very sort of scaled back guns for hunting. Veterinarians in most countries can have access to fairly high power firearms, but limited to a single shot for putting down animals, you know, big animals like cows and so on. But there are nations that do have reasonably large scale gun ownership that do not have this same issue that America has. So what's different there? I mean, part of it's culture. I think Canada still has a much stronger hunting culture. There's still, you know, big areas of wilderness, big gaps between places, and so on. So firearms ownership in that sense kind of makes a bit more sense. So they own a lot of guns, but they're different kinds of guns for the most part. And culturally, it's much more British, shall we say. There's a culture of politeness and I'm going to use the word collectivism. You know, people see themselves as part of a society rather than necessarily as this whole rugged individualism thing. And obviously I'm talking in very broad terms. But it's not just Canada. There are other, you know, first world nations with large amounts of guns. A lot of the Scandinavian nations have a fairly large amount of firearms, and a lot of that is to do with hunting and you know, living in the wilds and so on, at least as far as Europe gets wild. But it's also for defense, which is what the American constitutional right to bear arms used to be about. You know, these nations are relatively small, relatively low population, and quite close to what used to be the USSR. And they couldn't raise and maintain a huge standing army in the way that the US has. So it was very much, you know, militia. Have your fit and capable population trained and ready to become an army at the drop of a furry hat, you know. So a large part of what goes on in those nations is that people do a mandatory term of military or civil service, learn their way around firearms. In some places, you know, households are essentially issued a rifle ready to be used in self-defense. But there's a culture again of a more collectivist outlook of duty and responsibility, taught how to use them and everything properly. So there's a difference in culture there that maybe the US could learn from by perhaps returning to a kind of more militia stance, perhaps. You know, that's one way that it could be done. But it's this combination of things that makes America different and makes it more dangerous. Well, okay, so what solutions exist to America's gun problem? There's nothing that's easy. It's all going to be expensive. It's all going to require a large number of years. It's all going to require, you know, a commitment from at least a majority of the population to making a change, and it's probably going to be bloody. What's going on now in the wake of this latest school shooting is probably what it's going to take to make a change, and that is not the rational arguments, however sound and solid they might be, but the emotional arguments. You know, it's hard as a human being not to respond to crying children, bereaved mothers, all the rest of it, and to want something to be done. Now that's a dangerous way to go about things because things are often knee-jerk, but at this point maybe that's what's necessary. Who knows? I mean, the most obvious solution is to ban guns. You know, apart from a very few exceptions for people in particular roles for particular uses. I mean, here you're basically limited to break actions, breech loading shotguns, or semi-automatic shotguns with no more than 3 rounds, bolt-action rifles, again with limited ammunition for hunting. Yeah, that's pretty much it to all intents and purposes. You need special licensing for anything else. You need licensing for the shotguns and the rifles and everything else as well. And if you don't have that licensing, you're not allowed to have the gun, and that's a breach of the law. So, you know, that's the kind of degree of control that is held here. You know, what guns you can own is cut right back, and in order to even own those, you need extensive background checks and all the rest of it. which doesn't mean there aren't going to be illegal guns around, but it does severely cut back on what's available. You know, a lot of people are using sawn-off shotguns, so stolen and sawn down, but you know, well, you can't do a huge amount with a couple of birdshot rounds. Deactivated guns, which tend to be smoothbore, unreliable, inaccurate bullets, hard to come by as well. You know, banning isn't a wholesale solution, and yes, bad guys do still have guns, but there's going to be a lot less of them, and they feel less need to have them or to use them. It de-escalates the threat of criminality and violence to a massive amount. Are we likely to see Americans go that far? No. It would be the best solution, but it would take years. There would be a lot of confrontations from people trying to hang on to their guns. It would flood the market with illegal guns as people sell them on. And it would get a huge amount of resistance from a large minority of the US population to do this. So, you know, it would take years during which people would be rather vulnerable. It would be bloody. It would seem repressive. You'd probably see political and social backlash. So, you know, that's, unless you do it incrementally, I don't think that's viable. Could you do what the kind of Scandinavian nations do and make it a responsibility as much or more than a right? Yeah, you probably could do that. That might be an easier way to go about it if you make it a requirement to have decent background checks, to have proper training. Yeah, essentially a gun license in the way that you have a driving license. So, you know, tighter checks. You can still have all the guns that you have now, semi-controlled, whatever, but there's a responsibility that goes through it, and maybe a yearly weekend of training and topping up on whatever else, so that gun owners are being checked up on, trained, made responsible, taught how to use them properly, lock them away properly, all the rest of it. You know, and make this a requirement of gun ownership. So you then have a responsibility, and the point is that you're supposed to be ready in case of whoever the fuck knows would invade America, or, you know, another civil war or an uprising or whatever else. You know, that's the point. You're supposed to be there for security, to supplement the American military or whatever. So that might be a solution. I think that would be one that might be more palatable to Americans. My pet solution is one that I would prefer a ban, but you know, that's coming from a British perspective. But my pet solution would be gun insurance. I know Americans are very wary of governmental power and socialism and all the rest of it, but this is a private solution that would, I think, solve and suppress the issue. And we already require people to have insurance for driving because of all the expense involved in owning a gun, and owning a car. You know, you crash, you wreck it, whatever, you hurt someone else. The insurance is there to pay medical bills, repair bills, all the rest of it. So your car insurance reflects the real social cost and level of risk that you present from owning this big, expensive thing that can cause a lot of damage. So gun insurance would do the same thing. If you had to pay gun insurance for each and every firearm that you owned, the insurance company could assess your level of risk, which they do ruthlessly with car insurance, and making it a requirement means that you would then be actually paying the social cost and the level of risk appropriate to the owning of a firearm. When you consider these school shootings, think of all the funerary costs, the medical bills, and so on. All that social damage could then be paid for through this gun insurance. And you'd also have to pay to cover people who are uninsured as well, you know, to reflect the real social damage of firearm ownership. Just as premiums in car ownership, car insurance cover that. This would make owning guns much more expensive. The insurance companies would be doing these ruthless checks and really assessing your level of risk. So if you were riskier, you could still own firearms, but it would be more expensive, just as it's more expensive for young men to own cars because of the insurance. Yeah, this would suppress firearms ownership. It would offset the medical costs, the funerary costs, the cost of damage, policing, all the rest of it. That seems like a win-win situation to me. There will be objections to that from gun owners, of course. Something needs to be done, but we need to actually think about what needs to be done. The emotional impetus towards change appears to be there. Trump is a populist, so he is offering to do some kind of control, perhaps, but the absolute bare minimum, because he's still siding with the Republicans. But there needs to be more. But you need to channel this emotion into something that is doable for the sake of everybody. What do you think? I know a lot of you will just object flat out to the idea of any kind of gun control, but what I want you to do in the comments or in any reply videos or anything anyone might make, I want you to think about how you could actually address the problem. Even if you're massively pro-gun, I want you to think about what would be acceptable to you and how you would go about solving these issues. Zang.
Now, Bob, consider this next question very carefully. What is your one purpose in life?
To explode, of course.